The journey to Saturn took 8 months. 8 months of darkness, of silence, of staring out at the same endless field of stars. The Odysseus was a small ship, built for short trips and quick maneuvers, not for carrying people across the solar system. Every corridor was narrow. Every bunk was barely longer than a person, and the air always had that recycled smell that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. But the crew made it work. They had to. Ares spent most of his days in the small observation deck, watching the stars crawl past. He had brought with him a box of his father's old journals, handwritten notes from the early days of designing the carrier's reactor. He had read them so many times that the pages were soft and the ink was fading, but he still found comfort in them. His father's handwriting was messy, full of crossed-out equations and notes in the margins that said things like, "Check this again," or maybe, "Try a different cooling system." It made him feel close to the man he had lost. Ilara spent her time in the cockpit, running simulations, checking trajectories, and keeping the ship on course. She did not like to sit still. When she was flying, she felt in control. When she was sitting in her bunk with nothing to do, her mind wandered to places she did not want to go. She thought about her father's face, the way he had smiled at her before the launch. She thought about the last transmission, the strain in his voice. She thought about what they might find at the end of this long, dark road. The other 10 crew members were a mix of engineers, medical staff, and 1 communications specialist. They were all professionals, chosen for their skills and their ability to keep calm under pressure. But even the most experienced among them could not hide the nervousness that crept in as the months passed. They were flying towards something no one had seen in 30 years. A ghost ship. A mystery. A piece of history that refused to die. One evening, about 6 months into the journey, Ares was in the observation deck when the ship's engineer found him. The engineer was a quiet woman with tired eyes and hands that never stopped moving, always fixing something, always adjusting something. "You should come see this," she said. Ares followed her to the main computer terminal. She pulled up a new data packet that had come through from the carrier. The signal had been growing stronger as they got closer, and now they were finally able to pull more than just fragments. "We got a clear section," the engineer said, pointing at the screen. "Life support logs. They're old, but they're detailed." Ares leaned in. The data showed that most of the carrier's habitat rings had been sealed off. Only one section near the reactor core showed any activity. The oxygen levels there were low but stable. Temperature was just above freezing. And there was movement. What kind of movement? Ares asked, his voice tight. The engineer shook her head. "The sensors are old. They can't tell me if it's human or just machinery cycling on and off. But something is moving in there. Something with mass." Ares stared at the numbers, his heart pounding in his chest. For months, he had been preparing himself for the possibility that they would find nothing. Empty corridors. Dead systems. A ship that had been running on autopilot for 3 decades. But movement meant something else. Movement meant someone was still there. Or something. He went to find Ilara. She was in the cockpit, as usual, running through the final approach calculations. She looked up when he entered, and one look at his face told her something had changed. "What is it?" she asked. He told her about the data, about the movement near the reactor, about the oxygen and the temperature. As he spoke, her expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper. "Something raw. My father," she said quietly. "Do you think he could have?" Ares did not answer immediately. He wanted to give her hope. He wanted to believe it himself. But he was a scientist, and scientists dealt in probabilities, not wishes. "The reactor is still running," he said carefully. "That means someone has been maintaining it. Whether that's your father, or my father, or someone else entirely. We won't know until we get there." Ilara nodded slowly. She turned back to the controls, her hands steady, even though her voice was not. Then let's get there faster. The final 2 months of the journey were the hardest. The crew became quiet, each person lost in their own thoughts. Meals were eaten in silence. Sleep came in short, restless bursts. Aris found himself standing at the observation deck more and more often, staring at the point in the darkness where he knew the carrier was waiting. It was still too far away to see, but he could feel it. A presence. Await.elara stopped running simulations and started training for the docking maneuver. She practiced on the ship's simulator for hours at a time, running the same approach again and again until her fingers moved without thinking. The carrier was not designed to be docked with by a small ship like the Odysseus. Its airlocks were built for massive supply vessels, for the kind of infrastructure that no longer existed. She would have to match the rotation of the carrier's central spine, compensate for its failing magnetic seals, and do it all with a ship that had less power and less maneuverability than anything she had ever flown. It's not going to be pretty, she told Aris one night after a particularly rough simulation. Even in the best case, we're going to bounce around. The docking collar might not hold. We could lose pressure. But you can do it, Aris said. It was not a question. Elara looked at him, and for a moment she looked tired. Tired of being brave. Tired of carrying the weight of everyone's expectations. I have to, she said simply. Then, on the 237th day of the journey, they arrived. Aris was in the observation deck when Saturn filled the viewport. The planet was enormous, a pale gold giant wrapped in rings of ice and dust. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. But he was not looking at Saturn. He was looking past it, at the small point of light that hung in the darkness beyond the carrier of Sol. Even from this distance, he could see that something was wrong. The ship was dark. The massive habitat rings that had once spun to create artificial gravity were still. 3 of them were intact, but the 4th was gone, not missing, but collapsed, a tangled mess of metal and debris that hung off the central spine like a broken wing. The hull was scarred with impacts, some of them old and faded, others fresh enough to reflect the distant sunlight. Elara saw it too. She had come up behind Aris without him noticing, and now she stood beside him, her face pale in the dim light. It looks dead, she whispered. It's not, Aris said. He pointed to the center of the ship, where a faint orange glow pulsed through a crack in the hull. That's the reactor. It's still burning. The crew gathered on the bridge, everyone staring at the screens. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The carrier was a monument to everything that had been lost, and now it hung in front of them like a challenge. Elara took her seat at the controls. Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady too when she spoke. All right, she said. Let's go see who's home. The approach took 3 hours. Elara guided the Odysseus through a field of debris that had once been the carrier's escort vessels, small ships that had been meant to protect the colony mission on its journey. Now they were frozen wreckage, spinning slowly in the void. Some of them had names painted on their hulls, faded but still readable. Aris read them as they passed, each one a reminder of the 5,000 names on that memorial wall back on Earth. When they finally reached the carrier, the scale of it stole his breath. The ship was enormous, far bigger than anything built since. Its central spine stretched for over a kilometer, and the intact habitat rings were wide enough to hold entire neighborhoods. It was a city. A dead city, floating in the dark. Elara lined up the docking approach. The carrier's primary airlock was a massive circular door on the side of the central spine. It was designed to connect with ships 10 times the size of the Odysseus, and the mismatch made the approach feel like trying. To park a bicycle in a garage meant for a truck. Magnetic seals are failing, the engineer reported from behind. Elara, I'm reading intermittent power to the docking clamps. We're going to have to do this manually. Elara nodded, her jaw tight. She eased the Odysseus forward, matching the carrier's slow rotation with tiny bursts from the maneuvering thrusters. The docking collar extended, a flexible tube that would create an airtight seal between the two ships. It touched the carrier's hull, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the seals caught. The tube locked into place with a heavy thud that echoed through the Odysseus. Alarms blared for a few seconds as the pressure equalized, and then everything went quiet. Elara let out a breath she did not know she had been holding. She looked at Aris, and he saw something in her eyes that he had not seen before. Not fear, not hope. Something in between. A readiness. We're in, she said. The crew began suiting up. The air on the carrier was unknown, the temperature was freezing, and there was no guarantee that the artificial gravity was working. Every person on the Odysseus knew that they were about to step into a place that had been sealed for 30 years. A place where 5,000 people had vanished. Aris pulled on his helmet and checked the seals. Through the glass, he saw Elara doing the same. Their eyes met, and for a moment, they were not a scientist and a pilot. They were two children who had lost their fathers to a ship that disappeared into the void. And now, after 30 years, they were finally G. The days that followed the announcement were unlike anything the world had seen in decades. News channels ran the story nonstop. Experts argued back and forth, some saying the signal was a hoax, others claiming it was a miracle. But for Aris and Elara, there was no time for debate. They had to move fast, because the signal from the carrier of Sol was not getting any stronger. Every day it flickered, sometimes fading so low that the technicians at the listening post thought it was gone for good. Then it would return, faint but steady, like a heartbeat refusing to stop. Aris spent most of his waking hours in a small office at the space agency, surrounded by old mission files and stacks of printouts. He was trying to decode more of the corrupted data bursts. Most of it was gibberish strings of numbers, half-finished sentences, system logs from 30 years ago. But every now and then, a piece of clear information would surface. A life support reading showing oxygen levels still holding. A reactor output report that suggested the core was running at barely 12% capacity. 12%. It was a number that haunted him. His father had designed that reactor to last for a century at full power. To be running so low meant something had drained it. Something big. Elara found him there one evening, long after everyone else had gone home. She stood in the doorway, watching him trace lines of data with his finger across a faded blueprint. "You haven't eaten?" she said. He looked up, blinking as if waking from a dream. I lost track of time. She walked in and sat across from him, placing a paper bag on the desk. "I brought you something. Nothing fancy. Just bread and some cheese from the cafeteria." Aris took it gratefully. As he ate, Elara studied the blueprints spread out before her. They showed the carrier in its original glory-4 massive habitat rings, a central spine holding everything together, the great fusion reactor at its heart. It looked like a city built for the stars. "Do you really think anyone is still alive?" she asked quietly. Aris paused, the bread halfway to his mouth. He had asked himself that question 1,000 times since that first night. "I don't know," he admitted. "The life support readings are confusing. They show breathable air in some sections, but not all. Temperature is barely above freezing in most of the ship. But the reactor is still running. Someone is keeping it running. Or something," Elara said, and then she shook her head. "Sorry, I've been listening to too many wild theories on the news. People are saying it's aliens, time loops, all kinds of nonsense." Aris managed a small smile. "It's not aliens. It's engineering." Someone has been maintaining that reactor for 3 decades. That doesn't happen by accident. Alara looked at him for a long moment. You really believe your father could have done it? You think he's still there? Aris put the bread down. His voice was soft. I don't know if he's alive, but I know he would never let that reactor die. Not while there was breath in his body. He used to tell me that a ship's heart is its engine. If the heart stops, everything stops. He loved that reactor like it was his child. Alara felt a lump form in her throat. She thought of her own father, Commander Vance. She remembered the way he would record video messages for her before every mission, always ending with the same words, I'll be home before you know it. He had been wrong about that. But maybe, just maybe, he had found a way to keep going all these years. The political battle for the mission grew fiercer by the day. A special session of the Global Council was called, and Aris and Alara were summoned to present their case. The hall was packed with representatives from every major nation, along with reporters, scientists, and families of the lost crew who had made the journey to be there. Aris spoke first. He laid out the evidence in simple terms, avoiding complicated jargon. He showed the signal data, the encryption match, the reactor readings. He explained that the carrier of Sol was in a stable orbit around Saturn, and that its location meant it could be reached. He spoke calmly, but his hands trembled slightly as he pointed to the images on the screen. When he finished, a representative from one of the larger spacefaring nations stood up. Dr. Thorne, he said, using Aris's formal title, even if what you say is true, the cost of a rescue mission would be enormous. We're talking about resources that could fund climate research, medical advancements, hunger programs. Why should we spend that money on a ghost ship? Before Aris could answer, Alara stepped forward. She was not a scientist, and she did not have charts or data. She only had her voice. My father was on that ship, she said, and the room went silent. I was 14 years old when I watched him leave. I watched the broadcast of his last transmission. I listened to the words catastrophic failure, repeated over and over, until I couldn't say them anymore. For 30 years, I buried him. I buried all of them. And now we have proof that they didn't die in an explosion. They didn't fall into Jupiter. They survived. They survived long enough to send a signal across the solar system to tell us they're still there. She paused, her eyes moving across the room. I'm not asking you to do this for my father. I'm asking you to do it for everyone who ever lost someone and never got to say goodbye. We have a chance to bring them home. Not their names on a memorial wall. Them, real people. If we turn our backs on that, then what kind of future are we even building? The silence that followed was different from before. It was not the silence of doubt. It was the silence of people who had just been reminded of something they had forgotten. The vote was close. There were arguments about budgets, risks, and the sheer impossibility of the task. But in the end, the mission was approved. The Odysseus, a small exploration vessel that had been sitting in dry dock for years, was pulled out and refitted. Engineers worked day and night to upgrade its engines and life support. The crew would be small, just 12 people, because the ship was not designed for long missions. Supplies were calculated down to the last meal. Every kilogram mattered. Aris was given the role of mission science officer. It was his data, his discovery, and no one argued that he deserved to see it through. Alara was chosen as the pilot. Her skills were unmatched, and everyone knew that docking with a derelict ship of that size would require nerves of steel and a steady hand dot in the weeks before launch. Aris found himself visiting the old memorial wall in the city center. It was a long stretch of polished stone, covered with 5,000 names. He had come here many times as a boy, standing beside his mother while she traced her fingers over his father's name. Now he stood alone, looking at the same spot. He did not know what they would find on the carrier. He did not know if his father was alive, or if Commander Vance was alive, or if any of the original crew had survived the 3 decades of silence. But he knew one thing for certain. The people on that ship had not given up. They had kept the reactor running. They had found a way to send a signal across the void. They had waited, and now, finally, someone was coming. Ilara found him at the wall later that evening. She did not say anything. She just stood beside him, her eyes scanning the rows of names until they landed on her father's, Elias Vance. She reached out and touched the letters. Something she had not done since she was a teenager. "I used to come here and promise him I would be brave," she said softly. "I think I was just trying to convince myself." Aris looked at her. "Are you scared?" She nodded, not hiding it. "I'm terrified. But I'm also tired of being scared. It's time to go find out the truth." They left the memorial wall together, walking out into the cold night air. Above them, the stars were scattered across the sky like scattered promises. Somewhere out there, beyond Saturn, a ship was waiting. A ship that had been lost for 30 years. A ship that was about to be found. The countdown had begun. It was meant to be the day humanity finally reached for the stars with both hands. The carrier of Sol stood in its orbital dock like a city made of metal and light, 5,000 souls aboard, ready to begin a journey that would take them farther than any human had ever gone. Families, scientists, engineers, soldiers, they had all left behind their old lives on Earth for the chance to build something new around a distant star. The world watched through every screen and telescope, holding its breath. Among the thousands on that ship was Commander Elias Vance, a man who had spent his entire career preparing for this single moment. He stood on the bridge, looking out at the curve of Earth below, and felt the weight of everything. His wife had passed years ago, but his daughter, just 14, was back on the ground, watching her father's face on a screen. He had promised her he would send messages from every leg of the journey. He believed it with his whole heart. Down on Earth, a young boy named Aris sat with his mother in a crowded viewing center. His father was the chief engineer of the carrier, the man responsible for the ship's heart, its fusion reactor. Aris was too young to fully understand the mission, but he understood the pride in his mother's quiet tears, and the way she gripped his hand as the countdown began. To him, the ship was not just a machine. It was where his father lived now. The launch was flawless. The carrier of Sol pulled away from Earth, its massive engines burning with a steady blue glow, and for 3 days the world celebrated. News anchors called it the dawn of a new age. Children drew pictures of the ship in school. The crew sent back cheerful videos, showing off their quarters, the greenhouses where they would grow food, the labs where they would conduct experiments. Commander Vance recorded a special message for his daughter, telling her he was proud of her and that he would be watching her grow up. From the stars, then everything changed. Carrier was approaching Jupiter for a gravity assist. Carefully planned maneuver. That would slingshot it toward the outer solar system. Mission Control on Earth was in constant communication, tracking every reading. Aris's father had sent a routine systems check just an hour before the maneuver. Everything was green. What happened next became a moment etched into the memory of everyone alive that day. A burst of static filled every receiver. Then, for a few seconds, a clear transmission came through. The voice was Commander Vance's, but it was strained, nothing like the calm and collected man the world had seen before. He said only a few words, encountering unexpected gravitational anomaly, attempting to compensate. This is not. And then the line went dead. Silence. For hours, Mission Control tried to re-establish contact. They sent signal after signal, each one unanswered. Telescopes turned toward Jupiter's orbit, searching for any sign of the ship. They found nothing. The carrier of Sol had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. The official explanation came after weeks of investigation. A catastrophic failure, they said. A rare combination of gravitational forces and a systems malfunction that must have torn the ship apart. Debris, if there was any, would have been pulled into Jupiter's atmosphere, leaving no trace. The world mourned. Flags flew at half-mast. Memorials were built. 5,000 names were carved into stone, including Commander Elias Vance and the chief engineer, Aris's father. For Aris, who was only 7 years old at the time, the loss was something he could never put into words. His mother became a shadow of herself, and the boy grew up with a quiet, burning need to understand what had really happened. He read every report, studied every piece of data, and as the years passed, he became one of the brightest minds in astrophysics. Not because he wanted fame or success, but because he needed to know. He needed to find the truth that the official reports had buried. Elara Vance grew up differently. She was the daughter of the lost commander, and the world never let her forget it. People looked at her with pity, whispered about her father's fate, and treated her like a symbol rather than a person. She hated it. She hated the memorials, the speeches, the way strangers would approach her with tears in their eyes. Instead of running from it, she channeled that anger into action. She became a pilot, then a test pilot, then one of the best in the space program. She flew faster and farther than anyone expected, always pushing, always proving that she was more than her father's tragedy. But deep down, she never stopped hearing his voice in her head, the last words he ever spoke, crackling through static. 30 years passed. The world moved on. Space exploration became smaller, more practical. Governments decided that sending people to the stars was too expensive, too dangerous. The carrier of Sol became a footnote in history books, a tragic lesson about the limits of human ambition. The families of the lost crew grew old, and many of them died without ever getting answers. Aris's mother passed away when he was in college, still believing her husband's ship had exploded in an instant. Aris, now a respected astrophysicist with sharp eyes and a quiet voice, had spent his career working at a deep space listening post far beyond the orbit of Pluto. It was a lonely job, but he preferred it. He spent his nights sifting through signals from the edge of the solar system, looking for patterns, listening to the hum of the cosmos. Most of his colleagues thought he was wasting his talents. They didn't know that every signal he analyzed, he compared to the fragments of data from the carrier's final moments. Then, one night, everything changed again. A signal appeared. It was faint, barely above the background noise, but it was structured. It was not random. Aris sat up in his chair, his heart beginning to pound. He spent hours cleaning the data, isolating the pattern. When the truth finally became clear, he could not breathe. The signal was using encryption protocols that had been decommissioned 30 years ago. Protocols designed for the carrier of Sol. The data was corrupted, but the source was unmistakable. The ship was not destroyed. It was out there, somewhere beyond Saturn, broadcasting on a loop. Aris did not sleep that night. He sent encrypted messages to the few people he trusted, and within days, a small secret team had formed. They verified his findings. They tracked the signal to a stable orbit around Saturn. They calculated the ship's energy signature and found that its reactor was still active, still providing power. When Aris finally stood before the International Space Agency's board and presented his evidence, the room was silent. He showed them the data, the encryption, the impossible fact that the carrier of Sol was not a grave, but a place where something or someone might still be alive. In the back of the room sat Elara Vance. She had been called there without explanation. When she heard the words, she felt the ground shift beneath her. For 30 years, she had convinced herself that her father was gone, that the past was a closed door. Now that door had been blown open. She looked at Aris across the room, and for the first time, she saw a reflection of her own obsession. Two people, carrying the same weight, arriving at the same impossible truth. The board debated for weeks. Politicians called it a waste of money. Scientists argued that a rescue mission was suicide. But Ilara, standing before the world's cameras, said something that no one could argue with. If there is even a 1% chance that someone on that ship is alive, she said, her voice steady, then we owe it to them to try. They are not data points. They are people. They are our people. The mission was approved. A small ship, the Odysseus, was hastily prepared. Its crew would be skeleton, its supplies limited. It was not the grand rescue anyone would have hoped for, but it was the only chance they had got as the launch date approached. Aris stood alone in the hangar, looking up at the Odysseus. He thought about his father, the chief engineer who had poured his life into the carrier. He thought about the 5,000 names on the memorial wall. And he thought about the signal, faint and persistent, calling across the void. Ilara found him there. She did not say anything for a long time. She just stood beside him, staring at the ship that would carry them both toward the ghosts of their past. You know, she finally said, everyone thinks we're doing this for closure. Aris glanced at her. And what do you think? She looked at him with eyes that had seen too much loss to be fragile anymore. I think closure is a lie people tell themselves when they're too scared to hope. She walked away, leaving Aris with the hum of the hangar lights and the weight of what they were about to do. In 3 days, they would leave Earth behind. They would travel 8 months across the cold dark toward a ship that had been lost for a generation. They did not know what they would find. They did not know if anyone was still alive, or if the reactor was stable, or if the signal was nothing more than a ghost in the machine. But they were going, because some promises, even those made 30 years ago, are never truly broken.